Bristol is a city that knows how to sell itself. The harbour, the suspension bridge, the street art, the music. For the men in this video, Bristol was something else entirely. It was a city where a cafe on Grosvenor Road in St Paul's was raided more times than any other premises in the United Kingdom, and kept opening again regardless. A city where a crack cocaine network ran so openly through 2 postcodes that a barrister told Bristol Crown Court it was the only place in England and Wales where supply was so visible day and night, every day, every year. A city where 3 Taurus handguns came in from Atlanta inside Bluetooth speakers. A city where a Bath-based kingpin distributed 79 kilograms of cocaine while a 17-year-old cycled the streets as his lookout. A city where a youth worker was stabbed in Grosvenor Park in July 2023, and detectives followed an e-bike across the city on council CCTV to find the answer. Today we are covering Bristol's most notorious organised crime groups, generation by generation, case by case. Section 1. The street that became Britain's most raided address. Grosvenor Road is a residential street in St Paul's, an inner suburb of Bristol that sits just northeast of the city centre, bounded to the west by the M32 motorway and to the south by Stokes Croft. The houses along Grosvenor Road are terraced, built in the Victorian era, colourful in the way that much of St Paul's is colourful, and unremarkable in their physical fabric. Number 27 no longer exists. The building that stood at that address for more than 3 decades was eventually closed by legal action under antisocial behaviour legislation in 2004, and then demolished. What stood there from 1971 onward was the Black and White Cafe, opened by Bertram Wilkes, a Jamaican-born man who had moved to Bristol in 1959. The cafe served Caribbean food. It also, for much of its operational life, served as the most intensively policed commercial premises in the United Kingdom. It was raided more times than any other building in the country. The Guardian described it as Britain's most dangerous hard drug den. It was the physical centre of St Paul's drug trade for the better part of 3 decades, and the organised crime groups that operated in and around it shaped what Bristol's criminal landscape looked like for the generation that followed. To understand the significance of Grosvenor Road, you have to understand what St Paul's represented in the context of Bristol's post-war history. The area had been home to a large Caribbean community since the 1950s, a consequence of the migration patterns that reshaped British cities in that period. By the 1970s, St Paul's was one of the most densely populated inner suburbs in the city, economically deprived, under-resourced, and carrying a deep institutional distrust of police that had been accumulating for years. That distrust erupted publicly on April 2, 1980, when officers raided the Black and White Cafe on Grosvenor Road. The riot that followed lasted several hours. Fire engines and police vehicles were set alight. 130 people were arrested. 25 were taken to hospital, including 19 police officers and members of the press. The St Paul's riot of 1980 became one of the most documented civil disturbances of that decade, and remains a reference point in discussions of policing and race in England. The Black and White Cafe was at its centre. The cafe survived the riot. It survived subsequent raids through the 1980s. Through the 1990s, as crack cocaine arrived in British cities in volume, and St Paul's became one of its primary distribution points in the southwest, the cafe remained. A former member of the Aggie crew, speaking years later to Bristol 247, described driving slowly down Grosvenor Road and pointing to where number 27 had been. He described it as the most notorious whatever you want to call it he had ever known, and he had grown up on that road. The Aggie crew took their name from a criminal practice, not from the surnames of their members. Aggravated burglary, known in the area as doing an Aggie, was what the founding members had in common before crack cocaine became the dominant commercial opportunity of the era. By the late 1980s and through the 1990s, the group had evolved far beyond burglary. They were running the crack cocaine trade across St Paul's and into surrounding areas. Their leader was known as King Aggie, a man named Clinton Wilson. Under his direction, the Aggie crew built a supply network that dominated the city's street-level drug market for the better part of a decade. A former member who later founded Bristol Life Centre, a charity supporting young people away from gang involvement, described the operation as controlling a tight criminal network of distribution across the area. The Black and White Cafe was one point of the distribution infrastructure. It was not the only one, but it was the most visible. The organisation of the crack cocaine trade through St. Paul's in that period was not disorganised. It was the opposite. The Aggie crew maintained a customer base, a supply chain, and a degree of territorial control over the streets around Grosvenor Road that kept competing operations out. The visibility of the trade was not incidental. A prosecuting barrister at Bristol Crown Court, opening a later case relating to the same postcode, told the court that the relevant areas in St. Paul's and Easton were known across the country, in the same way Calais was known for wine at cheap prices, for their stock of Class A substances available for supply day and night, every day of every year. That reputation did not arrive overnight. It was built through years of consistent open distribution, and the Aggie crew were the architects of the model that made it possible. The first significant rupture in that model came in 1998. 6 members of the Aggie crew were arrested and jailed after being caught with more than £1 million worth of crack cocaine. The details of the seizure, the specific addresses, and the precise chain of arrests are less documented in the available public record than the consequences of the event. What followed the 1998 convictions was immediate and structural. The removal of the Aggie crew's leadership from the streets of St. Paul's left a vacancy. That vacancy was filled rapidly, and by organisations that were not local in origin and not inclined to negotiate over territory. The Yardi gangs that moved into St. Paul's after 1998 had their own supply chains, their own methods of enforcing compliance, and their own relationship to the area. The Hype crew and the Mountain View posse were the most prominent of the groups that stepped into the space the Aggie crew had left. The transition was not peaceful, and the consequences of it would define the next chapter of Bristol's organised crime story. What happened when the Aggie crew came out of prison and found their territory occupied, the tax demand delivered at gunpoint in St. Paul's bars, the fireworks fired at the Black and White Cafe, and the Operation Mansion raids that put 36 people before the courts, is in the next section. Section 2. The Aggie crew, the Yardi War, and the turf that changed hands. In the months after the Aggie crew's key members were jailed in 1998, the Yardi gangs that moved into St. Paul's did not do so quietly. The Hype crew and the Mountain View posse established themselves in the territory the Aggie crew had controlled, taking over distribution points, building their own customer networks, and operating in and around the same streets. The Black and White Cafe at number 27 Grosvenor Road remained a commercial hub. The cafe had survived the 1980 riot and subsequent police operations. It continued to function as both a food premises and a venue for drug activity through the years of Yardi dominance. Avon and Somerset police raided it repeatedly throughout this period. Officers making those raids found substances, weapons, and immigration offenders on various occasions. The building's record as the most frequently raided commercial premises in the country was accumulating entry by entry. When the Aggie crew members began to be released from their 1998 sentences, they returned to streets that were no longer theirs. Clinton Wilson, King Aggie, and his associates came back to a St. Paul's that the Yardi groups had organised around their own hierarchies and their own rules. The Aggie crew's response was direct. Members armed themselves and, wearing balaclavas, visited the venues in St. Paul's where Yardi operations were concentrated. Their targets included the Black Swan pub and the Malcolm X Centre, both established gathering points in the area. The message they delivered at each location was specific and quantified. Yardi individuals operating in the area would pay a daily tax of £50 per person. Businesses being run under Yardi control would pay £100 per day. The tax was framed as the price of continued operation. It was not framed as a request. The Yardi groups did not accept the terms. The response was immediate. Associates of the Hype crew and Mountain View posse stormed a cafe run by the Aggie crew that also served as a front for an illegal gambling operation. The storming of that premises was the opening move in a turf war that included multiple shootings across the St. Paul's area over the period that followed. Both sides took the conflict seriously. At one point, Aggie crew members robbed the Black and White Cafe itself, a building they had previously been associated with, as a direct provocation aimed at the Yardi groups now using it. The escalation continued. Aggie crew members then discharged fireworks at the Black and White Cafe building in an attempt to draw the Yardi groups into an open confrontation. The move was theatrical, but the intent was real. Armed police patrols were deployed across St Paul's in response to the volume of incidents. The patrols did not resolve the conflict. What ended the immediate turf war was the rearrest of Aggie crew members for violations of the conditions of their release from the 1998 sentences. The parole breaches put the key figures back inside, removing them from the streets again, and the confrontation with the Yardi groups effectively ended. The Hype crew, the Mountain View posse, and associated Yardi operations were left in control of the St Paul's drug trade. The cafe at number 27 Grosvenor Road continued to operate. By the early 2000s, the situation in St Paul's had reached a level of visibility that was attracting national attention. An Observer investigation published in February 2003 described the Black and White Cafe as Britain's most dangerous hard drug den. The reporting noted the building's record for police raids and detailed the scale of crack cocaine distribution operating out of the St Paul's and Eastern areas. Avon and Somerset police responded with Operation Mansion, a major crackdown targeting the crack cocaine trade in Bristol. Hundreds of officers, including firearms specialists, took part in a series of coordinated raids across St Paul's over a period of 10 days. 36 people were arrested as part of the operation. Of those charged, 29 faced drugs and firearms offences. 27 of the 29 charged were Jamaican nationals. A parallel operation, separately referenced in the public record from the same period as Operation Atrium, had earlier arrested 56 people in the St Paul's area, 36 of them Jamaican nationals, in a sweep that also uncovered a bogus college in St Paul's that had provided long-term visas to more than 300 Jamaican nationals. Of those individuals, 45 were subsequently charged with drug offences, 11 with weapons charges, 1 with rape, and another with attempted murder. A further 121 were detained on immigration grounds, while 148 remained outstanding. The Black and White Cafe finally closed on 25 June 2004 under legal action brought using new anti-social behaviour legislation. An independent report on its closure described it as a legendary Jamaican drug cafe. The building was subsequently demolished. Number 27 Grosvenor Road became a gap in the terrace. The supply trade it had anchored for more than 30 years did not disappear with it. It moved, redistributed, adapted. The streets of St Paul's and Eastern remained active. The prosecutions that followed, in the years and decades after the cafe closed, would involve different names, different structures, and different investigative methods. But the territory was the same. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next generation of Bristol street conflict drew a new boundary line. The M32 motorway, which cuts along the western edge of St Paul's, became the divide between two rival groups. The High Street crew operated out of Eastern on one side, the Bristol Bloods claimed St Paul's on the other. The names and the geography of that conflict are in the next section. Section 3. The High Street crew, the Bristol Bloods, and the M32 dividing line. Jamaica Street is a short road in St Paul's, close enough to where the Black and White Cafe once stood that you can walk between them in under 2 minutes. In the years after the cafe closed in 2004 and the Operation Mansion arrests reduced the visible Yardi presence in the area, the drug trade in St Paul's and Eastern did not stop. It adapted. The personnel changed, the geography remained, and along the streets and parks and housing estates of those two districts, a new conflict began to take shape between two groups that Avon and Somerset police would eventually name publicly: the Eastern-based High Street crew and the St Paul's-based Bristol Bloods. The organising geography of this conflict was the M32 motorway. The M32 runs along the western edge of St Paul's before cutting north toward the M4. It is a functional piece of infrastructure that carries commuter and freight traffic between the city centre and the motorway network. For the young men involved in the street conflict of the late 2000s and early 2010s, it functioned as something closer to a border. St Paul's sat to one side, Eastern sat to the other. The rival online videos that were being produced and circulated in 2010 and 2011, which community workers and police were monitoring at the time, were explicit about that division. The videos were territorial declarations, filmed in the streets and parks, and on the estates that each group associated with. The language in them was the language of opposition, identification through contrast, allegiance through geography. Community workers who operated in both areas during that period described the dynamic to the Bristol Cable. Jason and Wahid, both street conflict coordinators with the organisation Bright Outlooks, talked about what drew young people into these structures. The descriptions they gave were not of predatory recruitment, but of a more gradual gravitational pull. Young men who felt that their street affiliation treated them better than their family did. Networks that offered belonging, protection, and a kind of identity that the available, legitimate routes were not providing. The attraction was not primarily commercial, it was relational, and that made the conflict harder to address than a purely economic analysis of drug distribution would suggest. Avon and Somerset Police's own public statement on the High Street crew in the Bristol Bloods was measured but direct. The key individuals involved, the force confirmed, had been convicted and jailed for various crimes. As a result, the same sorts of problems the conflicts had produced were no longer occurring in the same form. One of those key individuals, a former member of the Bristol Bloods, was arrested in 2011 for firearms offences. He subsequently left the criminal life and began working with Bright Outlooks, becoming one of the community workers helping to pull younger people away from the cycle he had been part of himself. What replaced the High Street crew and Bristol Bloods dynamic in the years that followed was not peace. It was a continuation of the same underlying conditions through different structures. Operation Tibia, a major Avon and Somerset Police undercover operation, triggered by a letter from community leaders in St Paul's describing antisocial behaviour, drug dealing and drug taking on their doorsteps, culminated in a series of dawn raids on approximately 40 properties in November 2015. The raids swept through Easton and St Paul's in the early hours, 91 officers deployed across multiple simultaneous targets. By January 2016, 66 people had been sentenced at Bristol Crown Court for a total of 181 years. The defendants ranged in age from 17 to 53. Judge Martin Picton, concluding the sentencing, acknowledged that community groups had specifically asked police to act, and that the operation had been a direct response to residents requesting that their streets be reclaimed. The supply that 66 prison sentences temporarily interrupted was, as the community workers and local journalists observing the aftermath noted, a trade that continued regardless, because the arrests had addressed supply without addressing demand. The case that follows Operation Tibia belongs to a different tier entirely. Andrew Baker of Stoke Gifford, documented by the Bristol Cable as the corner man, ran protection rackets, cocaine and blackmail from Stoke Gifford to the M25 until a car bug and a talkative sidekick ended it all. That case is next. Section 4. Andrew Baker, the corner man and the blackmail conspiracy. Baker's Ground is a residential address on the outskirts of Bristol, in the Stoke Gifford area of South Gloucestershire. The name of the street is coincidental, but the Bristol Cable, which spent the better part of a year investigating the man who lived there, noted the irony regardless. Andrew Baker, 52 at the time of his conviction, had lived at an address in Stoke Gifford while operating a criminal enterprise that the Bristol Cable and journalist Michael Gillard documented in a 4-part investigation under the collective title The Corner Man, the nickname Baker had acquired for his habit of taking a corner, a percentage, out of every criminal deal that came within reach. The taxman had declared him bankrupt for non-payment, while detectives watched him renovate his large house. He had no declared income of any substance. He described himself as a security consultant. Baker's background was in London. He had grown up in South London and built his early career working door security for high society nightclub groups in the early 1990s, where he acquired connections to criminal figures operating at a level well above street distribution. His association with the Adams crime family, one of the most significant organised crime groups to emerge from North London, formed the backdrop to a series of major incidents that were investigated by the Metropolitan Police over 2 decades, but never resulted in conviction. Baker was acquitted in 3 separate major trials for kidnap, blackmail, and murder-related offences over the years before his Bristol conviction. At least 10 people were placed in the Metropolitan Police Witness Protection Scheme between 2003 and 2009 after giving information or evidence against him. His reputation in the criminal communities he moved through was built on those acquittals as much as on anything he was known to have done. By 2004, Baker had relocated to Bristol with his partner. He built what the Bristol Cable's investigation described as a security empire along the M4 corridor, running protection for nightclubs, bars, lap dance venues, and tattoo parlours across Bristol and the surrounding area. The criminal element of that operation involved the extraction of money from businesses through fear rather than service. In 2017, the conspiracies that would end his freedom in Bristol were under surveillance by the South West Regional Organised Crime Unit. Officers bugged his car. They also bugged the car of his enforcer in Bristol, Adam Hodinott, aged 48, formerly of the Circle, Bath, a physically imposing man with 25 prior convictions for violence and drugs, who had only recently completed a prison sentence for similar offences when he came back into Baker's orbit. Hodinott, unlike Baker, talked freely in his car. The recordings of those conversations provided the prosecution with material that made denial significantly harder. The cocaine conspiracy involved Baker acting as guarantor for a purchase of 1 kilogram of high-purity cocaine, arranged by Hodinott and sourced through John Gordon, aged 47, of Kynaston Road, Thornton Heath, London, a man Baker knew through years of shared involvement in door security and a mutual attachment to Crystal Palace Football Club. Gordon was known in South London as the Barber, both for running a barbershop in Croydon and for a reputation with a knife. The cocaine was transported from London to Bristol by Justin Green and Danny Bond, who were intercepted. Carl Newman's home in Newton Road, Cadbury Heath, was used to store the kilogram of cocaine and to manufacture ecstasy in wholesale quantities, with an industrial pill press and logo punch sets found on the premises, alongside thousands of ecstasy tablets. The blackmail element of the case involved Hodinott and Baker demanding money from 3 Bristol and South Gloucestershire business owners, with the explicit or implied threat of violence if they refused. One victim was approached on a golf course at the Kendalshire Club in July 2017. Another was told his house and family would be burned down if payment was not made. Hodinott left his name and phone number on a threatening voicemail sent to one of the victims. The sentencing at Bristol Crown Court in December 2018 produced the following. Andrew Baker, 52, formerly of Stoke Gifford, received 8 years for conspiracy to supply cocaine and a consecutive 3 years and 6 months for conspiracy to blackmail, totaling 11 years and 6 months. As he was led from the dock, Baker sang The Clash. Adam Hodinott, 48, formerly of Bath, received 12 years for the drug conspiracies and a consecutive 2 years and 6 months for blackmail. John Gordon, 47, of Thornton Heath, London, received 8 years. David Woolley, 54, of Plymouth, received 12 years. Carl Newman, 38, of Cadbury Heath, received 9 years and 4 months. Liam Waugh, 30, of Bishopsworth, received 9 years and 8 months. Matthew Sellers, 40, formerly of Kingswood, received 6 years. Justin Green, 45, of Brentwood, received 5 years and 4 months. Danny Bond, 46, of Surrey, received 4 years and 4 months. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 3 Taurus handguns were purchased legally in Atlanta, Georgia, packed into Bluetooth speakers, and delivered by courier to a house on Frampton Crescent in Fishponds. The man who filmed himself holding them and advertising them for sale was Kenville Hall. That case is in the next section. Section 5. The Atlanta Connection, the Fishponds Delivery, and 3 Taurus Pistols. Frampton Crescent is a residential street in Fishponds, a suburb in the east of Bristol, roughly 3 miles from the city centre. In November 2019, a parcel was delivered to an address on that street. The parcel contained a Bluetooth speaker. The man who answered the door and signed for it was Nico Lacroix, aged 23, who lived at the same address as the man the parcel was actually intended for, Kenville Hall, aged 30. Lacroix signed for the delivery because Hall was not present at the time. He believed the parcel contained cannabis being imported for his flatmate. He was wrong about the contents. Inside the Bluetooth speaker was a 9mm Taurus self-loading pistol, purchased legally at a gun store in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States, concealed inside the speaker casing and posted to Bristol through a regular courier service. The operation that produced that delivery had been running for weeks prior to the November 2019 fish ponds parcel. 3 brand new Taurus handguns in total were involved, a 9mm Taurus self-loading pistol in the first speaker sent to Frampton Crescent, and a second package sent to a property in Hackney, East London, which contained 2 further firearms concealed in the same way, a 9mm Taurus self-loading pistol and a Taurus .40 caliber self-loading pistol. The London package was collected by Hall the following day and transported to Bristol, where the weapons were to be sold. As a result of intelligence being shared between Avon and Somerset police and their counterparts in the United States, officers in Miami intercepted a third package before it could be exported. That package, also concealed inside a speaker, contained 330 rounds of ammunition. The investigation involved cooperation between Avon and Somerset Police, the National Crime Agency, and the United States Homeland Security Investigations Agency. Armed officers surrounded the address on Frampton Crescent in Fish Ponds in November 2019 and made their arrests. A fifth man, Rafiq Mawson, aged 29, of Stanway Court, Hackney, was detained separately in London. During the investigation, officers recovered a video that Hall had recorded on an encrypted social media platform on his own mobile phone. The video showed Hall filming himself holding the weapons. Detective Chief Inspector Simon Dufall described it at the time of sentencing as chilling footage being used to advertise the weapons to criminal associates. The handguns had been test-fired and were confirmed as viable. Judge James Patrick, sentencing the men at Bristol Crown Court, told those before him that each of the 330 rounds of ammunition intercepted in Miami had the capacity to kill or maim, and that the weapons were destined for the hands of criminals. The sentencing at Bristol Crown Court on 13th of October 2020 produced the following outcomes. Kenville Hall, 30, of Frampton Crescent Fish Ponds, who pleaded guilty to 2 counts of conspiring to supply a firearm and 1 count of conspiring to possess ammunition, received 17 years and 2 months. Busiso Benjamin, 30, of Gorse Hill Fish Ponds, who pleaded guilty to 2 counts of conspiring to supply a firearm, received 12 years. Rafiq Mawson, 29, of Stanway Court, Hackney, who pleaded guilty to 1 count of conspiring to supply a firearm, received 11 years and 6 months. Alcott Fleming, 44, of Quarry Lane, Lawrence Weston, who pleaded guilty to 2 counts of conspiring to supply a firearm, received 10 years and 5 months. Nico Lacroix, 23, of Frampton Crescent Fish Ponds, who admitted encouraging or assisting the commission of an offence, received 4 months suspended for 2 years, with 200 hours of unpaid work, given the court's acceptance that he genuinely believed the parcel contained cannabis rather than firearms. The combined custodial sentence for the 4 men who received immediate terms was more than 51 years. The Crown Prosecution Service's senior advocate, Richard Posner, noted after sentencing that the case had succeeded through effective cooperation between Avon and Somerset Police and multiple agencies both in the United Kingdom and the United States. The specific method, brand new legally purchased handguns shipped inside consumer electronics through standard courier networks, represented the kind of international supply route that required international investigative resources to dismantle. The guns arrived as ordinary deliveries. They were signed for at the front door. They were then to be sold, in Hall's own footage, to whoever in Bristol's criminal world was willing to pay the price. Romain Heyman of Portland Place, Bath, was operating at an entirely different level to anything that had come before it in this video. 79 kilograms of cocaine, a handgun with a submachine gun conversion kit in a padlocked suitcase, and an EncroChat handle that read Locksmith-Rome. That case is next. Section 6. Romain Heyman, the EncroChat Empire, and 26 years. Portland Place is a residential address in the centre of Bath, a Georgian city roughly 12 miles southeast of Bristol. At the time of his arrest, Romain Heyman, aged 30, lived there. In the spring of 2020, he was operating as the central figure in 4 conspiracies to supply cocaine and heroin from London and the Midlands to the southwest, and 2 conspiracies to launder the millions of pounds those conspiracies were generating. His EncroChat handle was Locksmith Rome. The encrypted messaging platform EncroChat had been used by serious organised crime groups across Europe, under the belief that its security architecture made it impenetrable to law enforcement. In the spring of 2020, European law enforcement agencies dismantled the platform and extracted years of communications. For Heyman, the messages that investigators pulled from the Locksmith Rome account provided a detailed operational record of everything he had been doing. The investigation that followed was codenamed Operation Venetic by UK law enforcement. The Southwest Regional Organised Crime Unit took the lead on the Bath and Bristol elements. What the EncroChat messages and accompanying surveillance showed was a supply network of considerable sophistication and scale. Heyman sourced multi-kilogram quantities of cocaine and heroin from London and Sheffield suppliers, distributed them across Bath and Bristol, cooked cocaine himself on the premises he controlled to produce crack cocaine for sale, and laundered the proceeds through a structure that investigators pieced together over the course of a lengthy investigation. The Encro messages showed Heyman discussing his aspirations to become a dominant force in drug supply across the southwest, including plans to import hundreds of kilograms at a time. He was not a runner or a courier. He was the hub through which product and money moved in multiple directions simultaneously. Undercover surveillance officers watched Heyman distribute an estimated 79 kilograms of cocaine in a matter of months. On one specific occasion, officers watched as Heyman and his 17-year-old assistant, Tekla Selassie, carried 3 bags laden with £540,000 in cash to a car in Bath. They then collected a further 7 kilograms of cocaine. Selassie, operating under the EncroChat handle YoungTech on a device Heyman had provided him, served as a lookout and delivery assistant. On the day Heyman sent him the message confirming it would be a busy one, Selassie cycled the streets around Bath checking the vicinity as Heyman conducted his business. When officers moved to make the arrest on 29th of May 2020, Heyman had just taken delivery of 7-kilogram blocks of cocaine from London at Leon Reed's Bath flat and sent a photograph of the Fendi-branded blocks to his London supplier with the message confirming they had arrived safely. It was his final EncroChat communication. 5 minutes later, he was arrested leaving the flat. What officers found inside the flat went considerably beyond the cocaine. A padlocked suitcase contained a handgun, 25 rounds of ammunition, a silencer, and a kit specifically designed to adapt the weapon to function as a submachine gun. A drawer contained £23,000 in cash. A money counter was present. The equipment Heyman had been using to cook crack cocaine was there. Officers subsequently searched 2 further Bath addresses Heyman had been paying to use. At a property in Twerton, £24,000 was recovered from inside a safe. At a property in Snow Hill, officers found 54 grams of cocaine, 3.7 kilograms of crystallized MDMA, 3,000 MDMA tablets, 1 kilogram of ketamine, 200 grams of cutting agent, and a hydraulic press. Heyman had boasted to associates on EncroChat that his gun had a silencer, the whole shebang. Romain Heyman was found guilty of 18 offences at Bristol Crown Court on 15th February 2022 and sentenced to 26 years in prison on 18th of February 2022. His supply chain extended across multiple cities and involved a series of couriers and intermediaries who were sentenced in subsequent proceedings. Adil Riaz, 31, formerly of Grimesthorpe, Sheffield, who had supplied more than 160 kilograms of cocaine to Heyman and laundered over £2.3 million in cash, received 24 years. Officers found a fully automatic AR-15 assault rifle, silencers, numerous rounds of ammunition, and 3 improvised explosive device hand grenades at an address associated with Riaz during the investigation. Pavel Perkin, 34, of Bognor Regis, who passed 55 kilograms of cocaine to Heyman across 5 deliveries worth nearly £2 million, received 15 years. Corneliu Preda, 37, of Salford, Bath, a regular driver for Heyman, received 10 years. Mehmet Sanchi, 37, of Swindon, who who transported at least 5 kilograms of cocaine and collected £418,000 in cash for Heyman on 2 trips, received 9 years. Tekla Selassie, 20, formerly of Eastfield Avenue, Bath, received 3 years in a young offenders institution. Tobias Slender, 44, formerly of Cheltenham, received 5 years. Across all proceedings arising from the Heyman network, the combined sentences totaled more than 124 years. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Romain Heyman's Bristol-based associate Christopher Barbosa purchased 46 kilograms of cocaine from him in just 2 months, spending over £1.5 million in the process. When the net closed in 2020, Barbosa ran, and it would take a Paris arrest and a year fighting extradition in a French cell before he came back. Section 7. Christopher Barbosa, Kilo Chris, and the Paris arrest. Sea Mills is a residential area in the northwest of Bristol, close to the River Avon, quiet in the way that suburban Bristol tends to be quiet. It is not the part of the city that features prominently in organised crime reporting. Christopher Barbosa, aged 32 and formerly of that address, did not operate visibly. That was the design. Detective Chief Inspector Adam Smith of the Southwest Regional Organised Crime Unit described Barbosa after his sentencing as a man who kept a low profile, deliberately letting others run the risk of storing and distributing controlled substances and moving cash under his instruction, while he managed the operation from a remove. The EncroChat handle Barbosa used was Kilo Chris. The name was not ironic, it described his volume. SWROCU identified Barbosa in May 2020 as a key associate of Romain Heyman during the same Operation Venetic investigation that had produced Heyman's arrest. The evidence from Barbosa's encrypted phone showed that in just 2 months of operation, he had purchased at least 46 kilograms of cocaine from Heyman at a total cost of over £1.5 million. He had also purchased at least 20 kilograms of cocaine from the Wiltshire-based Allison brothers, who were subsequently jailed in February 2025 as part of a separate £7 million drugs conspiracy investigation. A further 3 kilograms had been sourced from Alex Mail, a North Somerset man later jailed for 18 years in December 2024, who also went on the run before being returned to face justice. In total, the evidence against Barbosa showed he had handled more than 66 kilograms of cocaine, with a combined value running into millions of pounds. Across his supplier network alone, the individuals he bought from were receiving sentences measured in decades. The Bristol end of Barbosa's distribution operation used a safe house in Knowle West. The address belonged to Robert Dent, aged 43, of Willington Road. Home CCTV footage recovered from the property captured Dent receiving kilogram blocks of cocaine and handling thousands of pounds in cash on a repeated basis, the sheer frequency of the footage documenting what DCI Charlotte Tucker described as how busy the operation was. James Hell, aged 38 of Somerset Terrace, Bedminster, acted as a courier for the network. Dent and Hell were both sentenced at Bristol Crown Court on 6 October 2023. Dent received 12 years, Hell received 11 years. Kate Dent, 42, who had pleaded guilty to concealing £46,000 in cash found when the Knowle West address was searched and using criminal money to pay for improvements to the property, received a 2-year suspended sentence. Michelle Bray, 37, of Bedminster, Healy's partner, received 20 months suspended. Barbosa himself failed to appear at Bristol Magistrates Court on 31 March 2021. He was already gone. He moved across mainland Europe, his route tracked by investigators over the months that followed. He was eventually intercepted in Paris while attempting to travel onward from Dubai to Barcelona. French authorities detained him. He contested extradition at every available stage of the legal process. He spent a year in custody in France before the extradition was finally completed and he was returned to the United Kingdom in December 2024. The CPS International Unit had worked alongside SWROCU and French and Spanish law enforcement throughout the process. Senior Specialist Prosecutor Ruona Iguyovwe noted after sentencing that the case illustrated that there was nowhere to hide. Regardless of encrypted communications technology or international flight. Barbosa pleaded guilty at Bristol Crown Court to 3 counts of conspiracy to supply Class A substances covering cocaine, heroin, and crack cocaine, along with conspiracy to conceal, disguise, transfer, or remove criminal property and acquiring criminal property. He was sentenced to 19 years in prison on April 4, 2025. The next case begins on the day Joe Hatherall walked out of prison in January 2022, having served half of a 9-year sentence for cannabis supply. He was back in contact with a distribution network within days. The M5 cash stop that first cracked the case open, the niece's house in Hartcliffe, and the jet ski are in the next section. Section 8. Joe Hatherall, the luxury lifestyle, and the M5 cash stop. Emerson's Green is a residential suburb in South Gloucestershire, sitting on the eastern edge of the Bristol urban area, far enough from the city centre to feel suburban, but close enough to remain connected to the supply networks running through it. In January 2022, Joe Hatherall, aged 32, walked out of prison having served half of a 9-year sentence for conspiracy to supply cannabis. The sentence had been substantial. The time served was real. He returned to Emerson's Green and within days was back in contact with the network of associates he had maintained during his custody, arranging the movement of heroin and cocaine across the southwest. The interval between release and renewed criminal activity was not measured in weeks, it was measured in days. That specific detail, confirmed in the Avon and Somerset Police press release following his November 2025 sentencing, is worth holding for a moment. A 9-year sentence for drug supply, half of it served, and within days of release the same man was back arranging the movement of heroin and cocaine. The Southwest Regional Organised Crime Unit would spend the following 10 months building the case that put him back inside for significantly longer. The first significant break in the investigation came in February 2022, roughly a month after Hatherall's release. Dean Chick, aged 37, of Lisburn Road, Knoll, Bristol, was stopped by officers on the M5 northbound carriageway. The stop followed intelligence about an exchange involving one of Hatherall's associates. When officers searched Chick's vehicle, they found £31,230 in cash. There was no credible, innocent explanation for the specific sum. The intelligence context placed it squarely within the supply operation Hatherall had reactivated. Chick was subsequently sentenced to 3 years and 4 months for being concerned in the supply of cocaine. The M5 stop was the thread that gave investigators their first confirmed point of contact within the network. Hatherall's primary distribution arrangement within Bristol ran through Ben Bicknell, aged 37, of Whitchurch Lane. Bicknell was arrested in June 2022 and found in possession of snap bags containing cocaine when officers searched him. A search of his home address uncovered a small quantity of cocaine and almost £20,000 in cash. Neither the snap bags nor the cash were explainable through legitimate means. The investigation then produced a further forensic connection. On the same day Bicknell was arrested, officers acting on intelligence attended a separate address in Hartcliffe belonging to Bicknell's niece, Casey Cotterill. At that address they found 3 kilograms of heroin and 660 grams of cocaine. Forensic examination linked both Bicknell and a 4th member of the network, Stefan Dan, to the substances found there. Cotterill herself was subsequently handed a 2-year community order for her involvement in offering to supply and being concerned in the supply of controlled substances for the operation. Bicknell was sentenced to 8 years and 3 months for conspiracy to supply Class A substances. Stefan Dan, aged 33, of Greenfield Crescent, Nailsea, North Somerset, had been operating as a courier for the operation, moving product between addresses in the network. The forensic evidence connecting him to the Hartcliffe cache was consistent with his role. He was sentenced to 5 years and 7 months for conspiracy to supply Class A substances. The geographic spread of the network across this sentencing list is worth noting. Emerson's Green in South Gloucestershire at the top, Knoll and Whitchurch Lane in Bristol at the distribution level, Hartcliffe as a secondary storage location, and Nailsea in North Somerset supplying a courier. The operation stretched across the South Bristol commuter belt in a way that was deliberately dispersed and deliberately unglamorous. There were no EncroChat networks, there were no Atlantic firearms shipments. There was a man with a 9-year sentence for cannabis, back arranging heroin and cocaine supply within days of release, using a tight network of local connections to move product across the region. Hatherall was arrested in November 2022 and recalled to custody. Analysis of his encrypted phone confirmed what investigators had been building toward: a central, directing role in the organised crime group, funding a personal lifestyle that DCI Adam Smith of SWROCU described in detail after the sentencing. High-value vehicles, designer clothing, cosmetic dentistry, expensive watches, a jet ski. The cosmetic dentistry sits at the more unusual end of a visible consumption list, but the pattern it illustrates is the same one that appears throughout the Bristol and wider organised crime record. Money generated through the supply of controlled substances converted immediately into visible goods. The jet ski, the watches, the vehicles, each one a physical marker of income that could not be accounted for through any documented legitimate source. Hatherall had no such source. He had half-served a 9-year cannabis sentence, and a drug supply network reactivated within days of release. The total seizure across the investigation came to approximately 10 kilograms of cocaine and 4 kilograms of heroin, with a combined street value of over £1 million. Around £80,000 in cash was recovered from members of the network. More than £30,000 in cryptocurrency was confiscated directly from Hatherall. That cryptocurrency figure is a small but telling detail. The previous generation of Bristol drug operations had dealt in cash almost exclusively, moving physical bundles between addresses and couriers. Hatherall's operation retained those physical elements, as the M5 cash stop and the Hartcliffe stash demonstrated. But the presence of cryptocurrency in his personal holdings reflected the degree to which even relatively unglamorous regional supply operations had begun incorporating digital financial instruments alongside conventional cash. Joe Hatherall was sentenced at Bristol Crown Court on 7th November 2025 to 12 years and 6 months in prison. Dean Chick, 37, of Lisburn Road, Knoll, received 3 years and 4 months. Ben Bicknell, 37, of Whitchurch Lane, received 8 years and 3 months. Stephen Dan, 33, of Greenfield Crescent, Nailsea, received 5 years and 7 months. DCI. Adam Smith's assessment of Hatherall on the day of sentencing was direct: complete disregard for the harm caused by controlled substances, driven by greed and a desire to live a life of luxury that his legitimate circumstances could not have supported. The conviction of all members of the operation, Smith added, demonstrated that relentless pursuit of those involved in drug supply would continue, regardless of the attempts made to avoid detection. For Hatherall, those attempts had lasted less than a year before the M5 stop on a February morning put the first crack in what he had rebuilt. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section covers the most recent and most visceral chapters of Bristol's gang record. A 19-year-old youth worker stabbed in Grosvenor Park in July 2023. A Boxing Day pursuit through Bishopston that left a man with a brain injury and a collapsed lung on Bishop Road. The 16s, the 24s, and what the e-bike CCTV trail across the city eventually led investigators to find. Section 9. The 16s, the 24s, and the killing in Grosvenor Park. Grosvenor Park sits off Ashley Road in St Paul's, a short walk from where the Black and White Cafe once stood on Grosvenor Road. It is a small park in a dense residential area, the kind of space that families use in the daytime and young people gather in the evening. On the night of 21st July 2023, Eddie King Muthemba Kinuthia was in Grosvenor Park. He was 19 years old. He was from St Paul's. He worked with young people as a youth worker, a role that brought him into regular contact with exactly the kind of environment he was standing in that night. At shortly before 11 p.m, CCTV cameras mounted on council infrastructure captured 2 men arriving at the park on an e-bike, entering from the Ashley Road side. Eddie approached the pair. He was stabbed multiple times. He suffered catastrophic wounds. His family were at home nearby when a neighbour arrived and knocked urgently at the door. His mother, Irene Muthemba, described in her victim impact statement what she heard in the neighbour's voice and what she found when she got outside. She went down on her knees on the pavement, She held her son. She told him help was coming and asked him not to fall asleep. Eddie Knuthia did not survive. He was taken to the Queen's Medical Centre and died from his injuries. The investigation that followed was described by Detective Chief Inspector Mark Almond of Avon and Somerset Police as one of the most difficult his team had worked through. Not because the evidence was impossible to find, but because the community around it went quiet. The omerta, as the Crown Prosecution Service's Senior District Prosecutor Rachel Scott described it after the conviction, was understandable from the community's perspective, but it was real and it slowed the investigation at critical moments. DCI Almond acknowledged it directly. The breakthrough, when it came, was not from a witness walking into a police station. It was from council CCTV footage of an e-bike crossing the city. Officers from the Major Crime Investigation Team spent months tracking where the bike had come from and where it had gone after the attack. The CCTV network was painstaking to work through, but it was comprehensive enough, frame by frame, street by street, to establish the start point of the journey. The bike had come from Easton. The address where its route began was identified, and from that address, the investigation built outward. Zachariah Talbot Young, aged 27 and formerly of Carlisle Road, Easton, was identified as the man who had arrived at the park on the e-bike. The jury at Bristol Crown Court heard that Talbot Young was associated with the 1-6 gang, a group linked to the fish ponds area of Bristol. Eddie Knuthia knew members of the 2-4 gang, which operates in the St Paul's area. Those two groups had been in conflict, in the assessment of Avon and Somerset Police, for a period spanning several years before the night of 21st July 2023. DCI Almond described the broader pattern to ITV West Country in the aftermath of the conviction. He spoke of an association of violence between two groups of young men in Bristol, one cohort linked to St Paul's and one linked to fish ponds and Easton, which had been producing serious incidents across multiple years. The geography of that conflict is familiar from the earlier chapters of this story. St Paul's and Easton, separated by a short distance and in street gang terms by a very deep division. The M32 that had previously marked the boundary between the High Street crew and the Bristol Bloods had a successor dynamic playing out in the same postcode area, through different names and different individuals. The 1-6s and the 2-4s were not the same organisations as those that had preceded them. They were the current expression of a conflict the geography had been generating for decades. Talbot Young was convicted of Eddie Knuthia's murder at Bristol Crown Court on November 20th, 2025. The jury also found him guilty, along with a second man, Paul Elijah Hayden, aged 22, formerly of Hannam, of attempted murder in relation to a separate attack on a different young man, Nathan Williams, on February 2nd, 2024. That attack took place on Easton Way. Nathan, also 19 years old at the time, was inflicted with multiple knife wounds. His life was saved by the speed of medical intervention. The sentencing hearing for both men took place at Bristol Crown Court on November 25th, 2025. The Honourable Mr Justice Pepperell noted in sentencing that while Talbot Young was not the person who wielded the knife in either attack, he was an integral member of the two-man team that killed Eddie Knuthia and the larger team that attempted to kill Nathan Williams. That distinction made no real difference to the outcome. Zachariah Talbot Young was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 33 years and 136 days for the murder, and a concurrent life sentence with a minimum term of 20 years for the attempted murder. Paul Elijah Hayden was sentenced to life imprisonment for the attempted murder of Nathan Williams, with a minimum term of 17 years and 136 days. Eddie Knuthia's mother, Irene Muthemba, had waited 858 days from the night of July 21st, 2023, to address the court. She asked for the screen separating her from Talbot Young to be removed so she could speak to him directly. She told him his actions were deplorable and cowardly. She told him to tell his friends that what they thought was cool was pathetic and weak. She said that Eddie's legacy would live on through the lives saved from that conviction. She said there were no winners. She addressed young people involved in gang conflict from the same position. Carrying a knife would not help them. She was trying, in the middle of her own grief, to reach beyond the room. The conflict that produced the Boxing Day attack on Gloucester Road in December 2023 emerged from the same dynamic. The victim, a 24-year-old man from Fish Ponds, was a member of the 16. He had gone for a meal with friends at Lona Grill House and Juice Bar on Gloucester Road, Bishopston, on the evening of 26 December 2023. 3 men entered the same restaurant with their hoods up: Tayshan Graham, aged 21, of Easton; Reuben Fay, aged 20, of Lockleys; and AJ Edwards, aged 22, of Slough. They sat for 1 minute, studying the group, and left. Approximately 40 minutes later, they returned to Gloucester Road with Kane Henderson, aged 25, of Eastville. As the victim and his friends left the restaurant at 10:41 p.m, the 4 men pursued them. The victim tripped and fell on Bishop Road. He was stabbed at least 7 times where he lay. He suffered a brain injury, a fractured eye socket, a collapsed lung, and multiple significant wounds to his face, neck, shoulder, arm, chest, and buttock. Members of the public came to his aid. Emergency services attended. Hospital staff intervened. Avon and Somerset police confirmed it was almost certainly only through that chain of human intervention that he survived. He survived, but carries long-term, life-changing injuries as a result. Reuben Fay, Tayshan Graham, and Kane Henderson were convicted of attempted murder by a jury at Bristol Crown Court on 9th of October 2025. All 3 had previously admitted causing grievous bodily harm with intent, but denied the more serious charge. The jury disagreed. AJ Edwards was cleared of attempted murder, but had previously admitted grievous bodily harm with intent. Sentencing on 22 December 2025 at Bristol Crown Court produced the following. Reuben Fay, 20, of Lockleys, received 23 years detention. Tayshan Graham, 21, of Easton, received 23 years. Kane Henderson, 25, of Eastville, received 23 years. AJ Edwards, 22, of Slough, received 6 years for the GBH with intent, with a 2-year reduction for his guilty plea. His Honour Judge Michael Cullum noted that the personal circumstances of each of the 3 convicted of attempted murder were tragically similar. The combined total for all 4 was 75 years. DCI Jess Aston described the attack as targeted and planned, with 3 of those responsible attempting to evade justice by leaving Bristol almost immediately in its aftermath. The final section covers the most recent completed cases in Bristol's organised crime record. The Barton Hill cocaine network, taken apart by a fingerprint on a rucksack in Redfield. The Smoke Shack, running £100,000 a month from a house in Eastville. And what the full sweep of everything in this video reveals about a city that has been documenting the same conflict in the same postcodes for 30 years. Section 10. The Barton Hill network, the Smoke Shack, and what Bristol's full record shows. Harwood House is an address in the Barton Hill area of Bristol, a district in the east of the city between Easton and St Phillips. On 21 August 2024, a man was stopped and searched under the Misuse of Drugs Act by officers from Avon and Somerset Police following a short foot chase on Church Road, Redfield. A rucksack belonging to the man was found to contain a large quantity of Class A substances, subsequently confirmed as 3 kilograms of cocaine. The investigation that followed was built outward from a single forensic detail. Inquiries established that shortly before his arrest, the man had visited an address in Harwood House in Barton Hill. Examination of the packaging of the cocaine found in the rucksack identified fingerprints belonging to the occupant of that flat, a man named Gums. Officers executed a warrant at the Harwood House flat on February 11, 2025. Gums was located inside with a second person, Oisin Griffiths. A large quantity of controlled substances and cash were found at the address. Both were arrested. The network that Avon and Somerset Police and the serious organised crime team then dismantled around that central address produced 5 defendants sentenced at Bristol Crown Court on 26 June 2025. Gums, of Church Street, Redfield, received 12 years for his role as the network's central figure. He had also pleaded guilty to separate charges of supplying cocaine to an individual in Redfield in August 2024 and possession with intent to supply. Junior Griffiths, of Patchway, South Gloucestershire, received 8 years. Oisin Griffiths of Lambeth, London, received 3 years and 3 months. 2 further defendants, Chanter of Brook Road, Montpellier, and Ellick of Kingswood Heights, both received 3 years and 4 months. The total cocaine seized across the investigation was valued at approximately £1.1 million. Temporary Superintendent Ben Lavender, head of the Serious Organised Crime Team, noted after sentencing that the scale of the seizure would reduce harm significantly across the communities the network had been supplying. The 3-kilogram rucksack on Church Road, Redfield, is in some ways the tidiest entry point into a drug conspiracy in Bristol's recent record. A foot chase, a rucksack, a fingerprint. The simplicity of it sits in sharp contrast to the EncroChat architecture of the Heyman network or the Atlantic firearms logistics of the Fish Ponds Group. The investigation worked from the physical evidence outward and arrived at a network centred in Barton Hill that had been operating under what Lavender described as a belief that they were under the radar. The fingerprint proved otherwise. A few weeks later, on 1st July 2025, 3 men appeared at Bristol Crown Court for an operation of an entirely different character. Jake Hero Redman, aged 26, of North Road, St Andrews. Callum Cohen, aged 22, of Broadbury Road, Filwood Park, and Joseph Wilkes, aged 30, of Fountain Court, Eastville, had been running a cannabis delivery service under the brand name The Smoke Shack. They had built a social media presence for it. They had promoted it on an encrypted messaging app. They had produced branded clothing. They offered in-person same-day delivery to hundreds of addresses across Bristol and sent product across the country by post. Acting Detective Inspector Stuart Cumin of SWROCU estimated the group was making in excess of £100,000 every month over a significant period of time. The audacity of the branding was the detail that Detective Inspector Cumin returned to in his comments after sentencing. Not just the commercial scale of the operation, but the decision to create merchandise for it, to treat a drug distribution network as a business that deserved a uniform. Officers from SWROCU and Avon and Somerset Police executed a warrant at the Eastville hub address in June 2024. Inside they found black bin bags containing hundreds of brown sandwich bags, each one labelled with a postcode and a cash or cryptocurrency amount. The bags were the delivery system. Product out, payment dropped into the bag. Weapons including machetes, air rifles, knives and baseball bats were also present at the address. 7 kilograms of cannabis, nearly £17,000 in cash and cryptocurrency, and over £3,000 in designer clothing were seized. Joseph Wilkes ran at officers on entry and assaulted one of them before attempting to flee through the back door. He was detained outside. On arrest, he told officers the only reason he had not attacked them with a machete was that he had heard them shout police. Cohen and Heralt Redman were arrested a short distance from the address. Wilkes was jailed for 4 years and 6 months, including the additional assault offence. Heralt Redman received 3 years and 3 months. Cohen received an 18-month suspended sentence. Step back from the cases individually and look at what 30 years of Bristol's organised crime record actually shows. The Aggie crew dominated crack cocaine supply through the 1990s from a cafe at number 27 Grosvenor Road. Yardi gangs took the territory when the Aggie crew went to prison, and the tax demand delivered at gunpoint in St Paul's bars started a turf war. Operation Mansion arrested 36 people, 27 of them Jamaican nationals, in a 10-day sweep across St Paul's in the early 2000s. Operation Tibia put 66 street-level distributors in custody for a combined 181 years in January 2016. Andrew Baker of Stoke Gifford ran blackmail and cocaine networks across Bristol for years, while acquitting himself of kidnap, blackmail and murder in 3 separate trials, until a bug in his car ended the run in 2018, with 11 years and 6 months. 3 Taurus handguns came in from Atlanta inside Bluetooth speakers and were jailed for more than 51 combined years in 2020. Romaine Heyman of Portland Place, Bath, distributed 79 kilograms of cocaine and kept a handgun with a submachine gun conversion kit in a padlocked suitcase, and is serving 26 years from February 2022. Christopher Barbosa purchased 46 kilograms from Heyman in 2 months, ran to Paris, and is serving 19 years from April 2025. Joe Hatherall was back on the network within days of prison release and is serving 12 years and 6 months from November 2025. Eddie Knuthia was killed in Grosvenor Park on July 21, 2023, and Zachariah Talbot Young is serving life with a minimum of 33 years and 136 days from November 2025. The Boxing Day attackers on Gloucester Road received 75 years combined in December 2025. Grosvenor Park is a short walk from where the Black and White Cafe once stood, the same postcode, the same conflict, the same community trying to hold things together around it. Irene Muthemba, speaking outside Bristol Crown Court after her son's killer was sentenced, said it plainly: "Enough bloodshed. Adults have a responsibility to show young people carrying knives what it costs. Nothing is worth a life." If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.